Today's Gilpin lecture is also part of the Regent's Science for Seminaries project titled The Fuller Gospel, Pentecostalism and Science, funded by the Templeton Religion Trust and Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. And we're grateful for both of these organizations for their support. But today's lecture that you're about to hear in a moment is titled Thinking About Science and Faith, Conflict or Mutual Enrichment. And honestly, I cannot think of a better person, more qualified, more appropriate to speak on this topic than Professor Alister McGrath. Professor McGrath studied chemistry at Oxford University and followed this with an Oxford doctorate in molecular biophysics. He then switched to theology and held various positions teaching theology, including serving as Oxford University's Professor of Historical Theology, and more recently as the Andreas Idrus Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford. He is one of the world's best-known theologians, and is particularly well known for his textbook, Christian Theology: An Introduction, now in its 6th edition, and this book has been translated into more than 20 languages, and it is something that we also use here at Regent. So, would you put your hands together in the room or online and welcome Professor Alister McGrath.
Well, thank you very much. And it's very good to be here with you, even though I'm afraid this is remotely. Now, in this lecture, what I want to do is to explore how we might frame the relation of science and religion. What sort of lens can we use to help us understand how they might relate to each other? And I'm going to look at 3 broad models. I'm going to look at the idea of conflict, the idea of coexistence, and the idea of mutual enrichment. And basically, I'll explain them all to you, but the really important question is, what do you think? And I hope that my thinking will be of use to you. And I'll try and weave in some particular concerns relating to Pentecostalism towards the end of the lecture. Now, as Sima was saying, I began my career at Oxford studying chemistry back in the early 1970s. So, the question we're exploring this afternoon is of personal importance to me. And obviously, I'm going to tell you what I think, but I think it's much more interesting to engage in dialogue with other people. And I'm going to interact at points with what I hope you'll feel are 2 interesting dialogue partners. The physicist Albert Einstein, probably the best-known scientist of the 20th century, and the well-known atheist writer Richard Dawkins. And the 3 of us take very different positions, but I hope that offering you these 3 reference points will be useful to you to try to work out what you think is the best way of understanding this. So let me try and flesh out 3 main ways of thinking about the relation of science and religion. Here's the first of them. It's all about a war. And that's certainly the view of Richard Dawkins. Dawkins sees science and faith locked in conflict, and in the end, only science is going to emerge victorious. There can be no meaningful conversations between science and religion. Then there's a second viewpoint, which is a silo. And that's saying that science and religion are just completely different things. They can't relate to each other, they can't talk to each other. They're like insulated compartments of the human mind. They just don't interact with each other. And Albert Einstein represents the second approach. And although he treats science and religion as being quite different and non-interacting, he did think that each were really important in the business of living a meaningful life. So that's a very important point. He's not saying that science is right, religion is wrong. He's saying they're different. We've got to find a way of weaving them together into our understanding of life. There's a third position, which I would represent, and that is a dialogue. Again, a dialogue. And here, science and faith give us different perspectives on the great questions of life, and these can illuminate and inform each other. And that's the position I take now, although when I was a teenager back in the late 1960s, I have to say I was an atheist, and so I would have taken the first approach, the warfare approach, back in those days, but not anymore, because I came to faith at Oxford University, and that really changed the way I saw everything. Now, listen, I mean, we can draw more complicated and more detailed maps of the relation of science and faith, but the simple map I'm using is actually really quite useful. I think it will help you to get started thinking for yourself. So I think the key point to make is that there's no obviously right way of understanding the relation of science and religion. You've got to decide how you understand this for yourself. And you do find people who will say there is some kind of master narrative that characterizes the relation of science and faith. But actually, scholarship shows that this just really isn't the case. And the Oxford scholar John Hedley Brooke argues that serious scholarship in the history of science has revealed, and I quote, so extraordinarily rich and complex a relationship between science and religion in the past that general theses are difficult to sustain. The real lesson turns out to be the complexity. In other words, there's no obviously right way of understanding this, but that doesn't stop you from choosing. You can say, as far as I'm concerned, this is the best way of making sense of that, and I want to help you this afternoon decide what you think would be the best way for you. The relation of science and religion is complicated, so let's just begin then by looking at the conflict or the warfare model and explore this. This is the first one we're looking at, and it was the dominant narrative of the West until the end of the last century. And certainly Richard Dawkins would take this position, but I need to say to you, actually, there was very little trace of this approach in Britain during the 17th and 18th centuries as the scientific revolution got underway. And science and religion were seen as offering different approaches to the natural world, but they weren't seen as in competition or at war with each other. And as you may know, it was during this period that the very famous idea of God's two books, again, God's two books, began to become influential. I'll explain what that is in a moment. Basically, it's just the idea that God is the author of two books, the book of Scripture, the book of creation, the natural world. They're different, but God actually brought them both into being. And by reading them both, we can get a better and deeper understanding of God. Now, this warfare model began to become influential during the late 19th century. For example, John William Draper, an American author, wrote a book called A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And this catalyzed this perception science and religion are fighting for intellectual territory. I think it's a very important point to make that this is actually quite a recent development. We're looking at the late 19th century. And what's going on here is that particular social groups are in conflict about who has cultural authority. In this case, clergy and scientific professionals. And what you need to understand is that with the appearance of the professional scientist in the 19th century, a kind of struggle began as to who British culture would take more seriously, scientists or clergy. And the idea of the warfare of science and religion was part of this battle for cultural authority. And in the end, science won that particular battle. But I need to say to you that this does not mean that science and religion can't talk to each other or have a constructive conversation. It just meant that at that time, there were kind of social conditions that meant that some kind of reckoning between science and religion was going to happen, but not necessarily about their ideas, rather about cultural authority. But in recent years, we've seen this idea of a war between science and religion being picked up by Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins argues that only the natural sciences can offer reliable knowledge, and everything else, including religion, poses a threat to truth. And Dawkins' main criticism of religion relates to faith. And he thinks that faith represents a failure to think responsibly about evidence. And according to Dawkins, science proves its beliefs, whereas religious beliefs lack any evidential foundations. And Dawkins argues that science doesn't need faith because it's able to prove all of its beliefs with evidence-based reasoning. And we find this view in his book, The Selfish Gene. Here's what he writes in this book. What is faith? It is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. Now, there are some interesting points being made there, but it's not that simple. And you see, Dawkins needs to make a distinction between, listen closely, the total absence of supporting evidence, that's what he says, and the absence of totally supporting evidence. See the point I'm trying to make? The key point here is that there is evidence for these beliefs, but it's not always absolutely compelling. It's suggestive, not compelling. And that's why, of course, in science, this idea of inference to the best explanation is so important. There are a range of ways of explaining things. You've got to decide which of these is the best. And I think that's a very important point, because it does make the point that every now and then you have a dispute about, in effect, what is the best way of making sense of things. And a key point here is that what one generation thinks is the best way of understanding things is rejected by later generations. Some of you may have read Arthur Koestler's book, The Ghost in the Machine. And here's one of the things he says in this. Let me see what you make of this. He writes, "The progress of science is strewn like an ancient desert trail with the bleached skeletons of discarded theories which once seemed to possess eternal life." What he means by that is that science is on a journey, and what science thought was right at one point is not what it thinks at other points. In other words, science progresses by leaving things behind. I mean, another example, a very obvious one, is that 100 years ago, the scientific consensus was that the universe has always existed. But today, the consensus is that the universe came into being. I think that's a very important point. Science changes its mind. And that means that what science currently thinks may not be what it thinks in 50 or 100 years' time. And that's an important point I think we need to emphasize. Science is more provisional than Dawkins allows. But Dawkins is saying that science offers us the only toolkit that we can trust. We use it for everything. That's Dawkins' argument. That's not the way I see it. For me, each research discipline develops tools that are adapted to its tasks. And so physics and biology all use scientific methods, but they use different methods. And here's a point I want to make. A tool that works really well in one area may not work well in another. So I think the key point here is that Dawkins, I think, is being unrealistic by saying that science is able to answer all of our questions. It's not. It can answer scientific questions, but there are lots of questions that are about morality. What should we do? Or, of course, about belief in God. And, of course, there are many other political and ethical issues. And the key point I want to make is simply this. Science is very good at answering scientific questions, but that doesn't mean it can answer every question. That's a very important point, I think. We need to realize that reality is complex, and that means that very often one way of looking at the world isn't good enough to tell us everything that we know. And the key point I want to make is simply this, that our universe is so complicated that science is able to answer questions at one level, but we need to give additional answers to really make sense of a complicated world. So let me give you an example, because I'm aware that what I've been saying is a little bit abstract, and I'm sure you'd appreciate something very concrete and visual to understand this point. I'm going to draw on an analogy which was developed by the geologist Frank Rhodes back in the 1960s. And I want you to imagine a kettle that is boiling. Okay, so hold that in your mind. There's a kettle, it's boiling. Here's the question. Why? Why is that kettle boiling? And Rhodes says, look, you can give two kinds of answers. Here's one of them. At the scientific level, energy is being supplied, and that raises the temperature of the water to its boiling point. In other words, it's all about energy conversion. That's a scientific answer, and it's right. But it's not the full picture, because you could easily give another answer. Here's a second answer to the question, why is the kettle boiling? And it's this. It's boiling because I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. Now, listen to me. Both those answers are right. Does the fact that the first answer is right mean that the second one is wrong? No. Does the fact that the second answer is right make the first one wrong? No, they don't. They're just each part of a bigger picture. Here's what Rhodes says about his analogy. He says these are different answers, but both are true. Both are complementary and not competitive. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is the scientific explanation fills in part of a bigger picture, but it doesn't disclose that full picture in itself, on its own. We need that bigger picture, and science is part of that quest for knowledge, but that quest involves other things as well, including, of course, the Christian faith. Let me turn then to the second approach, which is all about silos. It's about an isolationist approach to science and religion. This argues that science and religion are totally different and they can't talk to each other. Both important, but they can't talk. Albert Einstein is a very good example of this. He sees science and religion as being two quite distinct and different areas of human reflection, and they deal with different aspects of our universe. It enables us to think science about how things work, but it doesn't tell us what they mean. That's what faith does. Religious faith is very good about dealing with questions of meaning and value. Science is more about functionality. How do things work? Now, in the very famous lecture given at Princeton back in 1939, Einstein made some very important points about the relation of science and religion. Science deals with facts, religion deals with values and meaning, and we need them both, but they are not the same. Now, Einstein makes the point that science has limits. Here's what he writes. See what you make of this. He writes, the scientific method can teach us nothing beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. The knowledge of what is does not open the door directly to what should be. In other words, science can tell us about what is, but not what ought to be. In other words, it cannot answer moral questions. And many of you may recognize the views of the philosopher David Hume here, because for Hume, there's no direct relationship between what actually happens in our world and what we believe is right, what ought to happen, the way we ought to behave. The first of those is science, the second is ethics. And for Einstein, we need them both, but they are completely different. And the argument I'm going to make to you here and elsewhere is that, yes, they are different, but we need them both. And that's the key point I want to bring out. Different, but we can bring them together, and we need them both. And for Einstein, religious faith comes into play in identifying the proper goals of human life and what we need to do to achieve them. In other words, it's not just about how we function as human beings, it's about what we mean, how we achieve our proper identity as God's creatures. And to me, that seems to be a very important point. Einstein argues that you can have the clearest and most complete knowledge of what is, I'm quoting from him, yet not be able to deduce from that what the goal of our aspirations ought to be. That, he suggests, must come from another source. So I think you can see what Einstein is doing. He's saying, look, there's this thing called science. It really matters, and it's there on this map. There's this other thing called religious faith, and it's also very important, and it's at a different place on the map. They can't talk directly to each other, but we need both of them if we're going to engage life's deepest questions. Now, I think it's a very important point to ask. I mean, many of us, I think, would say that the question of the meaning of life is really important. And science, doesn't really answer that question. It's very interesting, I think, to reflect on this question. What is it about human beings that makes us so interested in these big questions? And nobody really knows. You may have read the novelist Jeanette Winterton's personal memoir called Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, which I think is a great title for a book. But here's one of the things she says in this book. Listen to this. We cannot simply eat, sleep, hunt, and reproduce because we are meaning-seeking creatures. Again, we are meaning-seeking creatures. In other words, there's something about us that makes us want to know not simply, what we're meant to be doing in the world, but why we are here in the first place. What is the meaning of life? And of course, from a Christian perspective, we can argue that it's all about bearing God's image, that in fact, God has created us bearing his image, and that in some way feeds into our understanding of what really matters. If you like, we have a kind of homing instinct for God. So meaning really matters in life. But you see, meaning is not an empirical idea. It's not something you can detect or measure, and that means science doesn't help us to answer questions of meaning. And Karl Popper, who was a very noted philosopher of science, once talked about ultimate questions. Again, ultimate questions. And these basically are really important questions for human beings, which science can't answer. For example, what is the point of life? What is the good life? And how do I lead it? Now, here's how psychologist Michael Steger explores this question of meaning. He defines meaning as, I quote, the extent to which people comprehend, make sense of, or see significance in their lives, accompanied by the degree to which they perceive themselves to have a purpose, mission, or overarching aim in life. And I think that's helpful. It kind of gives us a way in which we begin to think about why these things matter to us so much. Now, psychology may not be able to tell us, what meaning is all about, but it certainly tells us how important meaning is to human beings and why religious faith plays a vital role in helping people discover who they really are and why they matter. We need to lead a meaningful and fulfilled life, and science doesn't help us answer those really significant questions of meaning. So I think there's some very important points being made here. Einstein is saying, look, science is great. It's at that point on the map. Religious faith is good. We really need answers to questions of meaning. It's on a different point on the map. So what I'm saying to you is that Einstein is saying both of these matter, but they are completely disconnected with each other. And my question is really, can we go further than that? This seems to me to amount to the fragmentation of reality. There's this over there, there's that over there, and we just can't hold them together, even though they're both important. But I think it's very important to say we need to find some way of bringing these together and holding them together. And you may have come across the American philosopher John Dewey. And back in the 1940s, he argued that the deepest problem of modern life is that we have failed to integrate our thoughts about how the world functions with our thoughts about value and purpose. And I think there's something in that. Einstein is very clear, for example, that scientists ought to be ethical people. I think that's very important. But Einstein's also saying, well, scientists can't use science to do ethics because science just isn't able to answer ethical questions. And therefore, they have to find answers to those questions somewhere else. So I think we need to, make an important point here, which is that science does have limits. And the reason I'm stressing this is to challenge Richard Dawkins. Dawkins is saying science tells us all we need to know about everything. I'm saying to you, I simply don't think that is right. That in effect, science is not able to deal with questions like the meaning of life or how we ought to behave. We need those things, but science isn't able to deliver them. Now, many of you may have come across a writer called Thomas H. Huxley, a great friend of Charles Darwin in the 19th century. But he was very, very clear that science simply is not able to deal with these big questions. He's very, very clear that you cannot absolutely prove what science is all about, and that science is not able to help us to think through how we should behave. And I think that's a very important. So the point I'm going to make is that I think Einstein does say some very helpful things, but I'd like to find some way of not simply saying science and faith are both important, but finding some way of saying we can hold them together. And so that's what I'm going to suggest is a third possible approach. And that's the one that I tend to like. And this is what's often called a dialogical approach to science and faith. So let me tell you about that. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, I went up to Oxford University back in the 1970s to study chemistry, and it was great fun. I really enjoyed that. That's when I discovered Albert Einstein, when I was doing some theoretical chemistry. And it means that my personal history led me to be interested in the relation of science and religion. To begin with, I was an atheist. I loved science. Then I discovered God and began to think, I want to love both God and science. How can I do that? And so I began to find ways of bringing science and faith together. I think that was very important. And in suggesting we think of a dialogue between science and faith, I want to emphasize we are not saying science and faith are the same thing. They're different. But, and this is the really important point, they can talk to each other. They can, in effect, help each other to see things that you may have missed, and they can give us a bigger picture of our world and ourselves than either could do on their own. And analogy I find quite helpful here is to do with spectacles. There's a pair of spectacles. I'm wearing them right now. Here's the point. If I look at the world through just one eye, I get a two-dimensional view of the world. If I use both my eyes, I get a three-dimensional view. It gives me added depth. See the point I'm trying to make? And for me, looking at the world through both science and faith gives us a richer, deeper, more satisfying view than either science or faith can on their own. And that, I think, is really very helpful. So there's a lot we could say about this. On the positive side, I think it means you try and understand both of them. Some of you listening to me this afternoon will have a background in science and be doing theology. You'll say, hey, this is important for me. Some of you will be saying, well, look, we don't really quite connect up with this at the scientific side. And I'll respect that. But let me tell you this. If you go into ministry, you may well end up talking to people who want to know, I'm a scientist. How do I hold my science and my faith together? And maybe you could say something that might be helpful here. And that's why I think going back to some of the analogies I've been giving you really gives you some useful ways of thinking about this. For example, that analogy of Frank Rhodes about a kettle boiling. There are many ways of understanding how our world functions, and we need to find a way of bringing them together. So the key question is, how do we hold multiple insights together? Our religious faith helps us to understand these things. Science helps us to understand these things about, for example, how our world functions. So let me introduce you to the philosopher Mary Midgley. Mary Midgley, a formidable lady who died recently, studied philosophy at Oxford and became very well known in the 1980s and 1990s as a public philosopher. She was very concerned about engaging questions that really mattered to people. And here's what she said in her final book called What is Philosophy For? Let me read this to you and see what you make of it. On the one hand, I want to emphasize that there really is only one world, but also on the other, that this world is so complex that we need lots of distinct thought patterns to understand it. We can't reduce all these ways of thinking to any single model. Instead, we have to use all our philosophical tools to bring these distinct kinds of thought together. So Midgley is making 2 points. Point number one, science can't answer all our questions about life. It's very good answering scientific questions, but not moral, existential, or religious questions, especially anything to do with values or meaning in life. Now, Richard Dawkins wouldn't agree with that, because for Dawkins, science is the only reliable intellectual authority and puts everyone else out of business. And that's a view that's known as scientism. But I don't think that's right. And certainly Mary Midgley doesn't think that's right. Her argument would simply be that science is part of the spectrum of human knowledge, but the spectrum of human knowledge is much bigger and broader than what science is able to tell us. And we need to look at other points on that spectrum. Now, Midgley actually is very helpful in giving us a way of visualizing how we might hold science and faith together. And she uses the metaphor of maps. She says we need lots of maps to make sense of ourselves and our complicated world. And I think it's a very useful idea. Midgley got this idea from a physicist at Bristol University called John Zeeman. And here's what she says about John Zeeman and why she found this idea so helpful. You may find this helpful as well. She writes, Zeeman developed the metaphor of knowledge as the use of maps. Not one map, but a collection of maps, all of them incomplete, and gradually, together, they shape our understanding of a new piece of country. By bringing those maps together and constantly improving them, he said, in time, we build up a composite picture, which brings us closer and closer to what the outside world is actually telling us. Now, let me try and unpack that for you, because I think it's actually really quite interesting. Midgley is saying that to make sense of ourselves and our world, we need to use lots of different maps. One of those is science. One of those will be our religious faith. And each of these is really useful, but it doesn't answer all of our questions. And so you might think, for example, of an atlas providing us with maps of a region like, North America or Europe, and it will give us, for example, a physical map of parts of Europe. It will give us also a political map of Europe. The physical maps shows us where mountains and rivers and lakes are. The political map shows you where national boundaries are. And the key point is these are different kinds of information, but we need them, and you can bring them together. If you want to go on holiday to some lakes, you'll use the physical map. If you are a refugee looking for political asylum, you'll use the political map because it tells you where a nation's boundaries end. And Midgley's point, very simply, is this. We have to use lots of maps as human beings, whether we like it or not. And certainly for Midgley, one of these maps is going to be about religious faith. Now, here's what she says. and let me quote to you from Midgley, no map shows everything. Each map concentrates on answering a particular set of questions. Each map explains the whole only in the sense of answering certain questions, but not others. And the key point she's making is that each set of questions arises and needs answers relevant to the problems that cause it, but that to make as much sense as possible of things, we need to use different maps. So Richard Dawkins is saying there's only one map and it's scientific. Albert Einstein is saying there are two different maps called science and faith, and they're completely different. I'm saying to you, we have these two maps and you can place them on top of each other and you get a deepened, richer understanding of what life is all about. So let's just think about this. I'm a human being, you're all human beings, and we need lots of help to keep going in life. Now, medicine is a very important area of human knowledge, and we might from time to time need to use medical maps to tell us what is wrong with us and what can be done to make us better. That's very important. But we also will use, if you like, a spiritual map, also to say, here is what's wrong with us, and here is what can be done about it. But you see the point I'm trying to make. In effect, we're talking about faith giving us a deeper, a richer understanding of what the problem with human nature is and what can be done about it, which goes far beyond what medicine is able to offer. It doesn't make medicine irrelevant. It's just saying we need more than medicine if we are going to live authentic and fulfill lives as human beings. So the point I'm trying to make to you is we can find ways of holding together our science and our faith. And I think this is really helpful. It, in effect, really helps us deal with this question of how human beings are able to find what they are really made for by God. And in the end, that's going to involve asking theological questions, which science simply isn't able to answer. So what I've done now is to talk about some themes in science and religion. And what I've done very briefly is to say, look, here are three different ways of thinking about it. I prefer the third. You can choose what you like. I'm just trying to say, here are some options. They will help you as you think through how you yourself do this. And what you're saying really is, look, I want to find a way of thinking about this, which recognizes the importance of my religious faith, but at the same time allows me to bring science into this without giving science some kind of monopoly on making sense of our world. But let me turn now to an issue I think might be very important to many Pentecostals. And that's the issue of signs, wonders, and miracles, which I know you addressed in a conference back in October of last year. I thought it might be good to talk about that a little bit. Now, earlier in this lecture, I mentioned the philosopher David Hume. And Hume was very critical of the idea of miracles. He argues that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature or a transgression of a law of nature. And Hume took the view that as science emphasized the importance of these laws of nature, this would seem to rule out signs, wonders, and miracles. But what I want to suggest to you is it's not that straightforward. And really, Hume has got some problems here. And I'm going to explain to you what they are, because I think you'll find this quite helpful in dealing with those who say science, in effect, miracles violates the laws of nature. The key point is that the idea of a law of nature is here being understood as a sort of almost divinely established rule that certain things can happen and certain things cannot. But many scientists would say, no, that can't be right. Natural laws are not saying this cannot happen, but rather we have not seen this happen up to this point. and therefore we don't think it can happen, but it might happen, and we're not ruling it out. Now, that I think is a very important point, because David Hume's definition of a miracle as violating the laws of nature clashes with another aspect of Hume's philosophy. And technically, this is known as the in effect impossibility of proving things by induction. If you think about this, a law of nature is saying, I've never seen this happen before, I didn't see it happen today, didn't see it happen tomorrow, so it's never going to happen. Hume himself makes the point, well, look, I may have seen this happen in the past or the present. That does not rule it happening in the future. In other words, you cannot say, because I personally haven't seen this happen, that this is not going to happen. Now, apologies for my coughing, not much I can do about this, I'm afraid. But the really important point is this, that for a scientist, you would say, well, look, one day there may be evidence that these things we believe cannot happen actually do happen. And if that is the case, we have to revise our understanding of what the laws of nature are. They are provisional. That's a very, very important. They're provisional. And we really need to be very, very clear about this. Now, this point, I think, is made lots and lots of times by writers who are very worried that we might become locked into what one generation regards as self-evidently true assumptions about the natural world. Because the point is that our knowledge of the laws of nature will expand over time. And back in 1925, the philosopher F.R. Tennant made this very significant assertion. He writes, until we shall have arrived at something like omniscience as to nature's constitution and intrinsic capacities, we cannot affirm any marvel to be beyond them. In other words, we just don't know. I think that's a very important point to make here in dealing with those who say, well, look, science says miracles never happen. It doesn't. It simply says, here's what normally happens. So if something unusual happens, either it means we have to rethink everything, or you say, no, it doesn't fit in, so I don't believe it did happen. And of course, early Christians, we know, found that the resurrection did not fit existing patterns of expectations. And they said, well, look, it's happened. We need to rethink our theology in its light. Now, let me go one step further now and talk about what we mean by the word miracle. I've given you David Hume's definition. It's a violation of the laws of nature. But most earlier Christian writers used a different understanding of a miracle. Here's what Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, said. A miracle is something that, I quote, surpasses the capabilities of nature. Again, something that surpasses the capabilities of nature. In other words, it's about God enabling things that wouldn't normally happen. It's all about, if you like, God enriching or God making things happen which are beyond what nature itself can do on its own. Now, there's a lot more that I really need to say, but I'm beginning to run out of time, and I want to give plenty of time for questions. So I want to end with a very positive note, and it's this, that actually I would say that a Christian is in a very strong position to hold together science and faith. I mentioned the idea of God's two books, the book that God wrote that we call Scripture, the book that God created that we call nature. And we read the book of nature in the light of Scripture. And we see nature as something that is beautiful and wonderful, but which is not complete in itself. It points us towards knowing God. Think, for example, of Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. In other words, you can appreciate the beauty of nature, but you see it also as a sign pointing beyond itself to the beauty and majesty of God. Now, there's much more I could say. I'm very happy to answer questions, but the key thing I've been trying to do is to give each of you a kind of intellectual toolkit to help you think these things through for yourself. And at least some of the things I've said will be helpful as you try to think about the relation of science and faith. So I think the best thing to do is to hand over to you, and I will gladly answer questions and see where we go from here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Alistair McGrath. Very clear and a thorough in a short time overview and helping us to think, particularly through these three approaches of the relation between science and faith. And thank you also bringing the kind of one of the key kind of aspects for us Pentecostal signs, wonders, and miracles into the conversation as well. Very much appreciated. Well, as we've already said, now we've got 20 to 30 minutes for questions. Good. We've got a question here from Paul Nichols, former student, who not long ago finished his master's here at Regents. His question is following. May I ask a question, please? My dissertation was a Pentecostal response to Hume's of miracles. My conclusion was that with the advances of theological prowess, Flew, Swinburne, Young, Lennox, Candy Gunther Brown, and others, that the Theological Academy was now in a much better place to dialogue with their scientific colleagues. The difficulty I found was that the academic rigor of evidence is fairly thin. There's plenty of empirical evidence, but is the evidence at an academic standard getting better? That's the question. I found Hume's arguments to be very outdated, though, as a kind of a footnote comment from Paul there.
Well, thank you, Paul, for what I think is a very good question. And in fact, I'm sure many people listening to this would have liked to ask a very similar question. So let me talk about this. Here's the first point I want to make. You're quite right. Hume actually is internally inconsistent. He contradicts himself. His approach to induction and his approach to laws of nature are actually inconsistent with each other. I think that point is now generally appreciated. And I think that, as you rightly say, it does really significantly reduce the intellectual credibility of his account of the laws of nature. And of course, that has very important implications for his critique of miracles. And you've mentioned a number of very important writers in more recent times, like Richard Swinburne is a very good example. I might mention Keith Ward as well. And these writers, again, would make a point very similar to what you're saying, which is actually we've kind of moved beyond this very inadequate framework that Hume gives us. And in effect, we've got to simply look at things the way they are and try and figure out what the bigger picture is. We can't go around saying this cannot happen. And we have to say, look, let's just observe what has happened and then try and figure out how that fits into things. Now, for me, the really important and very negative development that happens is to do with the philosopher Spinoza. Spinoza, in effect, takes the idea of a law of nature, simply meaning originally, this seems to be the pattern we observe. And in effect, a simple pattern was made into a stipulative law. Not this is what we see happening, but this is what can happen. This is what only can happen. And Spinoza had no evidence for that transition whatsoever. If you like, it's a philosophical absolutization of empirical observations, and it doesn't work. So I think you're right to say that there's now a much greater openness and receptivity towards the idea of things happening that just don't fit into the picture of things, which means we've got to, in effect, be open to revising our way of thinking about the world in the light of what has really happened. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we're talking about miracles more now than we might have been doing 50 years ago. So, Paul, thank you for that. It's a great question.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation and what you've thought. A question and a comment. Just wanted to know, you mentioned that you are an atheist. Just wanted to question is whether you are an atheist or an agnostic.
I think He was an atheist.
He was an atheist. He was,
he's a Christian now,
yeah. Whether you were an atheist or an agnostic, I'd like to know. Then the other thing is that you talked about the conflict between science and religion, according to Richard Dawkins, and then the separation by Albert Einstein. And then you've tried to see how to marry together. I see it in terms of that science is not really a thing. It's a way in which we try to ask questions about, the whole of creation and get answers, through theories and hypotheses, and then try it out and then get answers that explains the world to us. And I think that if you see the whole world as a continuum, God's whole creation, that the scientific method can both answer questions in the physical as well as in the religious, the meaning, the value, and all that as well. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, I was an atheist. And in fact, one of the things that I began to realize was problematic about that was that as a teenager, I was very, very clear that that there was no God, whereas my Christian friends believed that there was a God. But actually, the more I began to think about it, I began to realize that actually I could not prove that there was no God. In other words, that my atheism was actually a faith, something I couldn't prove. And that actually began to cause me some difficulties, which of course led me to reopening all of these questions. So that's a very good point at which to start. Your second point, I think, is good, that science isn't really something we can essentialize or reify. It's a method. And that means, in effect, that what is constant about science is it keeps on asking these questions, it keeps on using these tools, developing new tools. But what it thinks are the outcomes of its investigations will change over time. And I think that's a fair point to make, that science is really best defined in terms of its research methods rather than the results that it actually obtains. And that's the reason that's so important, is that there are writers like Richard Dawkins who in effect freeze frame science and say what science now says is right. This is the way things really are. Whereas most scientists would say, well, no, that's not right. Science is simply saying at the moment we think this, but we can't predict what we think in 100 years' time because we just don't know, and we may change our minds completely. So if you like, Dawkins is not representative of science as a whole, which actually is very much aware of the limits of scientific explanation and the fact that some things happen that don't really seem to fit into a neat scientific framework. So I think that's an interesting point to make. Thank you for a very good question.
From George's question, so this idea of scientific method or scientific methods, which I know is what you often talk about in your writings, as a theologian and a scientist, how appropriate do you think, or how valid is it to apply the scientific methods to studying our religious faith or Christianity?
I think we must be very careful not to distort theology by imposing a methodology from another discipline. But having said that, science can be very helpful. Let me give you an example. At the moment in the natural sciences, the predominant philosophy of scientific explanation is what is called inference to the best explanation. And it's very simple. What it says is you line up all the observations and you realize there are several ways of making sense of these. And so you try and figure out which of them makes the most sense. In other words, you're saying, right, let's try and line up the observations and test each theory against what we actually see, and then decide which one seems to do this best. Well, you know, something very similar is there in Christian theology. For example, trying to make sense of the identity of Christ. You look at all the observations in the New Testament. Christ said this, he did this happened. And you're asking, what is the best way of making sense of this? And what you find very, very quickly is that saying, well, Christ is just a good religious teacher, it doesn't work. Or just saying, well, you know, Christ is some kind of prophet. It doesn't work. It may give you some degree of explanation, but not enough. And you can see very easily, I think, what early Christian writers were doing was to say we are looking for the way of thinking about the identity of Christ that makes the most sense of all the biblical data. And that's why we believe in the incarnation, the two natures of Christ, not in the idea of Christ simply as some kind of prophet or a good religious teacher. So I think we need to be careful here not to in effect distort theology by imposing an alien method. What we can say is to say, look, here's what theologians do. And actually, there are similar things going on in science. Maybe we can learn something while at the same time making sure we preserve the distinct identity of Christian theology. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is from Rothwell. We really enjoyed the lecture. Thanks for having us. One of our 13-year-old has asked, as a Christian, what is the biggest challenge to your faith?
Well, thank you. And what's the biggest challenge to my faith? I'm going to give you two answers, okay? The simple answer is, for me, it's suffering. You know, I find suffering to be significant. And that's why it's so important for me as a Christian that in choosing to redeem us, God enters into this world of suffering and actually redeems us through suffering. So for me, suffering is the worst aspect of our world. And God, if you like, chose to suffer that for himself, to enter into this world and deal with that. So that's my answer. But here's the point I want to make in following through on this. Every worldview has a point of vulnerability. In other words, where there's something that doesn't really fit or doesn't fit as neatly as you'd like. For me as a Christian, it's suffering. But actually, I have to say, when I was an atheist, okay, I was very much aware there were certain things that just didn't fit with an atheist worldview. And why were so many people religious believers? I mean, the answer, they were simply deluded idiots, didn't really seem very satisfying. And my point is that any religious or anti-religious worldview has this problem. It's not absolutely secure. There's always a point of vulnerability. And for me, it's suffering. And actually, yet Christianity has some very important things to say about suffering. It helps us to cope with suffering, not just offer some kind of very simplistic explanation of why it's there. And that's really important. It enables us to live in a suffering world, while at the same time saying to us, one day we'll be in a better place. And that's something which keeps us going in this world. But the key point is, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, there is something that doesn't fit. And that, I think, is important. It's not just Christians who have this thing that doesn't fit. It's there for everyone. Thank you.
So, Alistair, within universities like Oxford and Cambridge, which of those three, the conflict, coexistence, or dialogue, is predominant?
I can answer that question because I talk a lot to scientists at Oxford. And I think the one that seems to be most common is actually the second one. In effect, saying, look, they're both there, but they don't really interact with each other. The people who hold the warfare model tend to be old, white, middle-class males. It's sociologically really quite precise. And that's one of the reasons why actually it's beginning to disappear, because people are beginning to realize it's not adequate. And it doesn't mean that they agree on what the alternative is, but certainly they will say historically this idea of a conflict just doesn't make sense of the historical evidence at all. And here's a very important point, I think. One of the things that very often people will say to me is, look, we know scientists who are really good scientists and are religious believers. So that shows you can hold these things together. I think that's a very important point. There's a really significant role for personal witness in dealing with these questions.
Let's go back online. Got here a question from James Seeger, actually one of our PhD students. Says, I totally understand that the physical sciences can't provide an answer to the meaning of life. However, how far do you think the social sciences can go in describing what people understand as the meaning of life? And what might happen if those descriptions oppose elements of Christian meaning?
Well, thank you for, again, a very good question. And you're absolutely right. The social sciences describe. And what they are doing is simply describing what people think. and they're not in any position to validate these. They're simply saying, here is, as a matter of empirical observation, what people think about these questions. And you can begin to ask some good questions like how is this shaped by age or geographical distribution? These are good questions. But there's no way that the social science is going to be able to say, this is a right answer, this is a wrong answer. And I think is a very important point to make, because sometimes you'll find people suggesting that the social sciences are able to answer these questions and show that some answers, such as the Christian answer, actually arise from misunderstandings or social pressures. It's not that simple. And it's a very important point to make there. So I would say simply that social sciences describe. They don't actually tell you what the meaning of life is, but they do help us to understand, A, what the wide range of possibilities might be, and also why people find these things so important. And that's a really important point to make, that as Christians, we can speak into the situation where people are looking for meaning in life. And we need to be able to explain what difference Christian faith does make to the way in which we live our lives out. So thank you for that one.
Hi, Alistair. Thanks for everything. So I've got a question about this culture. So, it seems like within our society, moving towards this kind of post-truth, constructivist, subjectivist sort of attitude to life. What do you think will be the place of this kind of science and Christian debate, going forward within that kind of framework? And then also in a kind of apologetic way, how can a Christian understanding of science, how might that make an effect in this world where maybe we're more kind of orientated towards like subjectivism, constructivism, etc.? Yep.
Good question. Back in 2006, when Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, came out, Richard Dawkins and I both appeared on a program on the BBC, and we were arguing with each other, but there was a third person there. And the third person took exactly the position you've described. We just make things up. We believe what we want to believe. I mean, why do we need to worry about facts? Why do we need to worry about evidence? And the curious thing is that actually Richard Dawkins and I both agreed this was nonsense. That was something we had in common. We both felt evidence was really important. So you're right. I mean, my truth, in other words, what I think is right is my truth, and you cannot invalidate it. You cannot challenge it, because if you do that, you are assaulting me as a person. And I think that it's all linked with identity politics. It's very, very difficult. And what I think you have to try and do is to show that, if I can put it like this, human beings are very good at deluding themselves in a very intellectually sophisticated way. And what we have to try and do is find a way of saying graciously, kindly, I don't think that's right. I don't think there's any evidence for that. In fact, I think all the evidence there points against that. And I think it's really a question of pastoral wisdom. How do you, in effect, challenge somebody who's clearly locked into a delusional world in which everything is exactly the way they want it? It's a make-believe world that doesn't correspond to the real world around them. And I think that's a very powerful point. Francis Schaeffer talks about this a lot in his apologetic writings, where he talks about how we construct this, if you like, impermeable shield around us to prevent us from being disturbed by the real world, so we can just believe whatever we like. And Schaeffer's argument is we have to find a way of allowing reality to impact on these delusions. So I think it's a really important point you're making. I think the answer is you have to find ways of graciously yet firmly saying, I'm sorry, this just isn't right. And that's a matter of pastoral wisdom, I'm afraid. But you are right. Our culture is going in that direction, where people, in effect, will believe whatever they want. And in fact, many people will say, well, you're entitled to think and believe like this, because that's what life's all about. And we do need, I think, to be able to challenge that. Thank you.
Another question here on online. Question is, if a tool works well in one area, it may not work well in another. I think that's this person is quoting you, I believe, Alistair. like you stated, then how can we call God the creator of all things, omnipotent, etc.?
Thank you. I've got the gist of that. So
Thank
let me
you.
try and answer. Here's what I want to begin by saying. Here is a thermometer. I hope you can see it. Okay, I'm holding up a thermometer, and someone might say, well, look, this is really, really good at telling me what my temperature is. And because it works so well for doing that, I'll use it for everything. In other words, the validation of a tool in one area is assumed to mean it's valid everywhere. So you might say, well, look, I'll try and work out what the meaning of life is. You look at the thermometer, oh dear, no reading there, right? There is no meaning of life. You know, it's nonsense. You know, every research method is designed to answer certain questions, to work in certain areas. You can't use them across the board. And that's a very important point to make. And of course, it leads into the next point you're making, which is actually really, we have to say, I think, that very often a research tool which might work well in one area is not merely inadequate in another, but may actually delude you. I think that's a really important point to make, that in effect, science cannot answer deep questions of meaning. And of course, I mean, theology can't answer the question as well. Theology cannot give an answer to what is the distance between the Earth and the moon. I mean, if it does give an answer, it simply repeats the scientific answer. But I can live with that because it doesn't really bother me that much what the difference between the Earth and the moon is. What really matters is what is the meaning of life and how do I lead a good life? And to me, that's really important. So I think the key point to make is that there's no problem in saying there are some questions theology can't answer. These are questions like, for example, how our world functions, something like that. That's not really that big a deal. Where theology comes into its own is to say it answers the question who we really are, what we really need, what's wrong with us, what can be done about it, and it gives us this hope of being transformed by God's grace. So I think that kind of way just helps begin to answer the question that you raised.
Question here from the room.
Hello. What do you think are the most common or significant ways that atheist scientists convert to Christian theism? And why do you think it is that people like Richard Dawkins still reject theology and its interaction, you know, in light of evidence and scientists changing their mind based on the evidence?
So let me talk about this. I think it's a really good question. Many scientists do come to faith. In fact, Dennis Alexander and I are just editing a book at the moment, which is 12 stories of people who came to faith by reading Richard Dawkins. Now, that will astonish you, but actually the common theme is, this is so simplistic, this can't be right. There has to be a better way of dealing with this. And so they began to explore Christianity. So I think that's a very important point to make. But what is it, I think, that actually makes people think about this? Very often, if you're a scientist, it's the beauty and wonder and complexity of the world. And just this deep feeling that there has to be more than a simple scientific explanation to help us understand why this is so. So what I want to say in closing is really, it's important to, if you are a scientist, to talk about how you hold your faith together with your science, because you never know who'll be listening in, and that might actually be a catalyst for a very important personal transformation. Thank you.